The rifle crack echoed across the valley like thunder, and Raymond Castillo dropped where he stood. Judith Foster worked the lever action without taking her eye from the scope, brass cartridge spinning gold in the morning light. 300 yards down the ridge, Brandon Castillo dove behind a boulder, finally understanding what his dead brother had learned too late. You do not steal from a woman who once tracked grizzlies with just a blade. The wind carried the scent of pine and gunpowder as Judith shifted position, moving like smoke through the timber. Her weathered hands knew this Winchester like a prayer, every scratch and worn spot familiar as her own scars. The men below scrambled for cover, their earlier swagger replaced by the desperate movements of prey. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Brandon Castillo pressed his back against granite, sweat cutting tracks through the dust on his face despite the mountain cold. His gang of 12 had been reduced to 5 in less than 10 minutes. The widow they had come to intimidate was systematically dismantling his operation with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of winter. This was not how it was supposed to go. 3 weeks earlier, Judith Foster had been just another struggling homesteader in the eyes of anyone watching. She rose before dawn as she had every day for the past 5 years, pulling on worn leather boots and a coat that had seen too many seasons. The mirror above her washstand showed a woman of 48 with steel gray eyes and hair the color of old silver, weathered by mountain wind and marked by loss. Her husband Samuel had been dead 3 years now. Consumption had taken him slow and cruel, leaving her alone on 200 acres of Montana territory that most folks said was too wild for a woman by herself. They were wrong about many things concerning Judith Foster. She stepped onto the porch of her cabin, breathing air so cold it burned her lungs. The homestead spread before her like a promise kept to the dead. Pasture land rolled down to Willow Creek, where cottonwoods marked the water's path through the valley. Beyond that, the ridge rose steep and dark, crowned with pine that had stood since before white men came to this country. Black Tusk stood in the near pasture, his coat steaming in the cold air. The stallion was her pride, 16 hands of midnight muscle with intelligence in his dark eyes that bordered on human. Samuel had bought him as a colt from a crow trader, paying more than they could afford for bloodlines that ran back to Spanish horses brought north by raiders and war parties. Judith walked to the fence, and Black Tusk came to her call. She ran her hands along his neck, feeling the power coiled beneath his winter coat. This horse could run 100 miles and still have fight left in him. He had carried her through blizzards that killed cattle and up trails that would challenge a mountain goat. He was worth more than the rest of her holdings combined, and every horseman within 300 miles knew it. She checked the fence line with the eye of someone who noticed everything. The posts were solid, the wire tight. No breaks, no signs of tampering. But something felt wrong, the way the air feels before lightning strikes. Judith had learned to trust that feeling long before she became a widow, trying to scratch life from stubborn ground. Inside the barn, she went through her morning routine. Feed for the horses, hay for the milk cow, grain for the chickens that provided eggs, and the occasional Sunday dinner. Her movements were economical, wasting no motion. Every task completed with the thoroughness of someone who understood that small mistakes could become large problems when you live 30 miles from the nearest neighbor. But her real attention was on the loose board in the back stall, the one that hid things better left hidden. Behind that board lay a life she had buried with deliberate care, a badge that had once carried the weight of federal authority, a Colt 45 with custom grips and a trigger job that could put 6 shots through a playing card at 50 paces. Letters of commendation from men whose names appeared in newspapers, praising work that never made it into official reports. Before she was Judith Foster, struggling widow, she had been something else entirely, something the men riding toward her valley would have been wise to remember. The Castillo brothers arrived on a Tuesday when storm clouds gathered over the peaks like an omen. Judith was breaking a young mare in the round pen when she heard hoofbeats on the mountain road. 6 riders came down the trail at an easy pace, confident as wolves entering a fold. Brandon Castillo rode point, a man who carried himself like someone accustomed to being obeyed. His brother Raymond flanked him, along with 4 others whose names Judith did not know, but whose type she recognized immediately. Hard men who had traded conscience for coin, the kind who hired their guns to whoever paid best. She continued working the mare, keeping her movements calm and steady, while her mind cataloged details. 6 horses, all well-fed and recently shod, good saddles, quality gear. These were not drifters or desperate men. They rode for someone with money and organization. Brandon Castillo dismounted at her fence and tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. He was handsome in the way of men who had learned to use their looks as a weapon, with dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. His smile never reached those eyes. "Good morning, ma'am," he said. "Mighty fine horse you got there." Judith brought the mare to a stop and faced the visitors. "Morning," she replied. "Something I can do for you, gentlemen." The word gentleman carried just enough edge to let them know she was not impressed by their numbers or their swagger. Brandon Castillo heard it and his smile grew wider, but colder. "Name's Brandon Castillo," he said. "This here's my brother Raymond. We represent certain business interests in the territory, interests that have taken notice of your operation." Judith said nothing, waiting. In her experience, men like this always talk too much, revealing more than they intended. "That stallion of yours has quite a reputation," Brandon continued. "Black Tusk, isn't it? Word is he's got bloodlines worth more than most men see in a lifetime." "He's not for sale," Judith said simply. Raymond Castillo laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Ma'am, you might want to reconsider that position. See, our employer has need of quality breeding stock. He's prepared to make you a generous offer." "And if I refuse?" Brandon's smile never wavered. "Well now, that would be unfortunate. Woman alone out here, accidents happen. Fires, wolves, all sorts of misfortunes. Shame to see a nice place like this come to harm." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke. Judith felt something cold and familiar settle in her chest, an old readiness she had hoped never to need again. "I appreciate your concern," she said quietly, "but Black Tusk stays where he is." The 6 men exchanged glances, and Raymond Castillo's hand drifted toward his gun. Judith noticed the movement without seeming to, the way she noticed everything that might matter when violence was in the air. "You might want to think this through, ma'am," Brandon said. "We'll be back tomorrow for your answer. I suggest you consider our offer carefully." They mounted and rode away, but Judith knew they would not go far. Men like this did not make idle threats. They would camp somewhere within sight of her valley, watching and waiting for her to show fear. They would be disappointed. That night, Judith sat by her fireplace cleaning a rifle that had not seen use in 5 years. The Winchester Model 1873 was a weapon she knew better than her own heartbeat, its lever action smooth as silk from countless hours of practice. She worked oil into the metal with movements that were almost meditation, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought left off. Samuel had known about her past, though she had told him only pieces of the truth. He knew she had worked for the federal marshals, tracking men across territory where local law feared to go. He knew she could read sign like scripture and shoot with precision that bordered on supernatural. What he had not known was how many men she had killed in service of justice, or how little sleep she had lost over their deaths. Some truths were too heavy to share, even with someone you loved. She finished with the rifle and moved to the loose board in her bedroom floor. The hiding place yielded treasures she had hoped never to need again. The badge, tarnished but still carrying weight of authority. The Colt, its grips worn smooth by her hands. A leather folder containing credentials that would make strong men step aside. And at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a knife with a blade 8 inches long and sharp enough to shave with. She had tracked wounded grizzlies into caves with this knife as her only companion, following blood trails through darkness where one mistake meant death. The bears had died, not her. Judith held the blade up to the firelight, testing its edge against her thumb. A thin line of red appeared, and she nodded with satisfaction. Some skills never left you, no matter how long you tried to bury them. Outside, wind howled through the pines like the voices of the dead. Somewhere in that darkness, 6 men were planning how to take what belonged to her. They thought they knew what they were dealing with. A widow, alone and vulnerable, easy prey for men with guns and cruel intentions. They were about to learn how wrong they were. She spent the rest of the night preparing. The cabin that had been a home became a fortress. Windows that offered views of the valley also provided fields of fire. The root cellar that stored preserves could hide a person for days. Every approach to the house was mapped in her mind, every advantage cataloged and prepared. By dawn, Judith Foster, the struggling widow, was gone. In her place stood someone harder, colder, infinitely more dangerous. Someone who had earned her reputation in blood and would not hesitate to do so again. The men coming for Black Tusk had made their choice. Now she would make hers. Brandon Castillo returned at noon with his brother and 4 hired guns, confident that a night to think would have changed the widow's mind. They found Judith Foster waiting for them in her yard, standing beside Black Tusk with one hand resting on his neck. She looked smaller in the daylight, more fragile. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her dress was the practical cotton of a woman who worked her own land. Nothing about her suggested the slightest threat to 6 armed men. That was her first advantage. "Well, ma'am," Brandon called out as they approached. "Trust you've had time to consider our proposition?" "I have," Judith replied. "My answer remains the same." Raymond Castillo spat into the dirt. "Brandon, we're wasting time with this nonsense. Take the horse and be done with it." His brother held up a hand. "Now, Raymond, let's be civilized about this. Ma'am, I'm afraid you're putting us in a difficult position. Our employer doesn't take kindly to disappointment." Judith's hand moved from Black Tusk's neck to rest on the fence post beside her. The movement seemed casual, nervous even. None of the men noticed that the post had been carefully prepared, that a loaded Winchester leaned against its far side where her fingers could find it in half a heartbeat. "Your employer will have to learn to live with disappointment," she said. The words carried a finality that made Brandon Castillo's eyes narrow. He was beginning to sense something beneath the widow's calm exterior, some quality that did not match her appearance. "Ma'am, I truly hate to see this turn unpleasant," he said, "but you're forcing our hand here." The 4 hired guns spread out in a rough semicircle, hands hovering near their weapons. They moved with the practiced ease of men who had done this before, intimidating lone settlers into compliance through superior numbers and implied violence. Judith watched them position themselves and felt the old familiar calm settle over her like armor. Time seemed to slow, the way it always did when violence became inevitable. Every detail crystallized with perfect clarity: the nervous shifting of horses, the wind direction that would affect a long shot, the way Raymond Castillo favored his right leg, suggesting an old wound that would slow him down. She had perhaps 3 seconds before they drew their guns. 3 seconds to decide whether to surrender Black Tusk or water this ground with blood. The decision was easier than it should have been. "I told you yesterday that accidents happen out here," Brandon said. "Shame when they do." "Yes," Judith replied quietly. "It truly is." Her hand closed on the Winchester's stock. The first shot took Raymond Castillo's center mass before his gun cleared leather. Judith worked the lever and put the second round through the shoulder of the man to her left, spinning him around and dropping him beside his horse. The other gunmen scattered, diving for cover that did not exist in the open yard. Judith was already moving, using Black Tusk as a shield while she gained the corner of her cabin. The stallion, trained for war as much as work, stood steady despite the gunfire erupting around him. His bloodlines included horses that had carried warriors into battle, and he knew the sound of combat. Brandon Castillo rolled behind the water trough, his confidence shattered by the widow's sudden transformation from victim to predator. The woman who had seemed helpless moments before was now systematically destroying his gang with precision that spoke of professional training. "Who the hell are you? Who are you?" he shouted. Judith's reply came with another rifle shot that splintered wood inches from his head. "Someone you should have left alone." The remaining gunman tried to establish a crossfire, but Judith knew this ground like her own heartbeat. She moved from cover to cover with the fluid grace of someone who had fought in terrain far more hostile than her own backyard. Every rock, every tree, every building had been mapped in her mind during the long night of preparation. Justin Hernandez, one of the hired guns, tried to flank her position by circling toward the barn. Judith let him come, tracking his movement through gaps in the timber. When he emerged from cover, she was waiting with a shot that dropped him 20 yards from his goal. The mathematics of the fight were simple and brutal. 6 men had become 3 in less than 2 minutes, and those 3 were pinned down by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The professional in Judith noted their poor tactics, their reliance on intimidation over actual skill. They had brought the wrong tools for this job. Brian Martinez, crouched behind the chicken coop, made the mistake of showing himself to get a better angle. Judith's Winchester spoke again. and Martinez discovered that pine boards provided concealment but not protection from a rifle bullet. That left Brandon Castillo and one remaining gunman, Samuel Richardson, trapped behind cover that grew less adequate with each passing moment. The water trough that had seemed solid was being steadily reduced to splinters by Judith's methodical fire. "Brandon," Richardson called out, his voice tight with fear. "This is insane. She's just one woman." "One woman who's killed half our crew," Brandon replied grimly. He was beginning to understand that they had stumbled into something far beyond a simple intimidation job. The widow's shooting was too precise, her movement too professional. This was not luck or desperation. This was skill honed by years of deadly experience. "Ma'am," he called out, "let's talk about this. Maybe we can work something out." Judith's answer was another shot that sent splinters flying from the trough. The time for talking had passed the moment they threatened her home. The siege might have continued until dark, but Judith had no intention of giving her enemies time to regroup or call for reinforcements. She had learned long ago that in combat, momentum was everything. Press the advantage or lose it. She moved through her cabin with the silence of smoke, emerging from the back door while her enemies focused on the front. The root cellar provided a concealed route to the barn, where she could establish a new firing position with clear lines of sight to both remaining men. Brandon Castillo realized his mistake too late. The woman who had been pinning them down from the cabin was now behind them, her rifle trained on their inadequate cover. He grabbed Richardson's arm and pointed toward the trees. "Move," he hissed. They broke from cover in a desperate rush toward the timberline, but Judith had anticipated this move. Her first shot took Richardson in the leg, sending him tumbling into the dirt. Her second shot was a deliberate miss, close enough to Brandon's head to let him know she could have killed him if she chose. Both men lay still, hands visible and empty. The fight had gone out of them as completely as water from a broken jug. Judith emerged from the barn, Winchester ready but not quite aimed. She walked toward the two survivors with the measured pace of someone completely in control of the situation. "Your friends are dead." "Dead," she told them matter-of-factly. "You're alive because I chose to let you live. That choice can be changed." Brandon Castillo struggled to his knees, his hands raised. "Lady, I don't know who you are, but we made a mistake." "A big mistake." "Yes," Judith agreed. "You did." She stood over the two men, her rifle casual in her hands but ready to fire at the first sign of treachery. The transformation from homesteader to hunter was complete now, and anyone looking at her would see what the Castillo brothers had failed to recognize. This was not a woman to be intimidated. This was someone who had walked through darker places than they could imagine and emerged victorious. "Who sent you?" she asked. Brandon hesitated, and Judith's rifle shifted slightly in his direction. The movement was small but unmistakably threatening. "Nathan Cross," he said quickly, "owns the mining operation up in Silver Creek. He's been buying up land for a railroad spur, and he wants this valley. And my horse." The horse was just a bonus. Cross figured if he couldn't buy you out, he'd take something valuable and force you to deal. Judith nodded slowly. She knew the name Nathan Cross, knew his reputation for getting what he wanted through money or violence. He owned judges and sheriffs across 3 counties, and he was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. "How many more men does Cross have?" she asked. Brandon's eyes darted toward the trees, as if he expected rescue to emerge from the shadows. 20, maybe 25. Professional guns, not like us. Judith considered this information while keeping her rifle trained on the 2 survivors. 25 men was more than she could handle in a direct confrontation, even with her skills and knowledge of the terrain. But there were other ways to fight a war than standing toe-to-toe with superior numbers. "You're going to carry a message back to Nathan Cross," Judith told Brandon Castillo. "Tell him that Judith Foster is not selling her land, and anyone who tries to take it will end up like your friends here." She gestured toward the bodies scattered around her yard. The morning sun was already drawing flies to the blood-soaked ground. "And tell him something else," she continued. "Tell him that before I was Judith Foster, I was Deputy U.S. Marshal Sarah Gomez. Tell him to look up that name in his files and see what it means." Brandon's face went white as the name registered. Every man who rode the wrong side of the law knew that name, knew the stories that followed it like shadows. Sarah Gomez, the marshal who had tracked Black Bear Williams across 3 territories in winter. Sarah Gomez, who had brought in the Dalton gang single-handed. Sarah Gomez, who had never failed to bring back her man, dead or alive. "You're her," Brandon whispered. "You're the ghost walker." Judith smiled without warmth. "That's what some people called me? Now you know why your friends are dead and you're still breathing. I've gotten soft in my old age." She stepped back and gestured toward their horses with her rifle barrel. "Take Richardson and get out of my valley. If I see any of Cross's men on my land again, I won't be so merciful." Brandon helped the wounded Richardson to his feet, both men moving with the careful deliberation of those who knew they were balanced on the edge of a blade. They mounted their horses and rode away without looking back, leaving their dead companions for the carrion birds. Judith watched them disappear over the ridge before allowing herself to relax. The immediate threat was over, but she knew this was only the beginning. Nathan Cross would not accept the loss of 6 men without retaliation, and now he knew exactly who he was dealing with. She walked to where Black Tusk stood calmly grazing, seemingly unaffected by the violence that had erupted around him. The stallion raised his head at her approach, and she ran her hand along his neck. "Well, boy," she said quietly, "looks like our quiet life just ended." The horse nickered softly as if he understood. Perhaps he did. War horses remembered the sound of battle, and Black Tusk's bloodlines carried memories of conflicts older than the white man's presence in this territory. Judith spent the rest of the day disposing of bodies and cleaning up the evidence of the fight. She dragged the corpses into a ravine 2 miles from her cabin, where coyotes and ravens would scatter the bones beyond recognition. Their horses she turned loose after removing their brands, knowing they would either find their way home or join the wild herds that roamed the high country. By evening, her yard looked peaceful again, but Judith knew that peace was an illusion. Nathan Cross would come for her with everything he had, and she would need help to survive what was coming. It was time to send word to old friends who owed her favors, time to call in debts that had been gathering interest for 5 years, time to remind the territory why they had called her the Ghost Walker. 3 days later, Jessica Taylor rode into Judith's valley leading a pack horse and wearing a smile that belonged on a schoolteacher rather than one of the deadliest women in the Montana Territory. She was small and blonde, with cornflower blue eyes that missed nothing and hands that could put 6 shots through a silver dollar at 30 paces. "Well, well," Jessica said as she dismounted. "When I got your message, I wondered if retirement had made you soft. Looks like I worried for nothing." She gestured toward the bullet holes in Judith's water trough and the fresh dirt where bodies had been dragged away. The signs of recent violence were subtle but unmistakable to someone who knew how to read them. Judith embraced her old partner, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. Jessica Taylor had ridden with her for 3 years, tracking outlaws and killers across the worst country the West had to offer. If anyone could be counted on when the odds were impossible, it was the woman who had once held off 12 Apache warriors while Judith circled behind their position. "Nathan Cross," Jessica said. "I heard he's been expanding his operation. Buying judges, hiring guns, acting like he owns the whole territory." "He thinks he can take my land by force," Judith replied. "Sent 6 men to intimidate me into selling." "I'm guessing that didn't work out the way he planned." "Not exactly." Jessica grinned, the expression transforming her face from schoolmarm to wolf. "How many did you leave breathing?" 2. Figured they could carry a message back to their boss." "Always were the sentimental type," Jessica said. "What's the word from town?" "Cross has 25 men camped at Silver Creek. Professional killers, most of them. He's telling everyone that a crazy widow murdered his men in cold blood, and he's just seeking justice." Judith snorted. "Justice. That's rich, coming from a man who's killed more people than cholera." The 2 women spent the evening planning their defense. Jessica had brought ammunition and supplies, along with intelligence gathered from contacts throughout the territory. Nathan Cross was indeed mobilizing his entire force, and he had put a bounty on Judith's head that would attract every gun-hungry drifter within 500 miles. But Jessica had also brought something else, word that other old companions were coming. Ruth Ramos was riding up from Colorado, where she had been working as a Pinkerton detective. Nancy Powell was en route from Wyoming, where she had been serving as a town marshal under an assumed name. The old team was reassembling, drawn by bonds forged in blood and fire. 4 women who had once been the most feared law enforcement unit in the West, reuniting to face a threat that would have sent lesser souls running for the horizon. "How long do we have?" Judith asked. Jessica checked her pocket watch. Ruth should be here tomorrow. Nancy the day after. Cross is probably waiting for his full force to assemble before he moves, so maybe a week. A week to prepare for a siege against overwhelming odds. Judith had faced worse, but never with so much to lose. This was her home, the place where she had built a life with Samuel and tried to leave the violence of her past behind. Now that past had come calling, and she would meet it on ground of her own choosing. Ruth Ramos arrived at dawn, her dark hair braided with silver and her eyes holding the same fierce intelligence that had made her the best tracker in 3 territories. She embraced Judith and Jessica with the easy familiarity of sisters who had shared death and emerged stronger for it. Nancy Powell rode in that evening, tall and rangy as a wolf, her red hair now touched with gray, but her gun hand as steady as ever. She had been the fastest draw among them, able to clear leather and fire before most men could blink. The 4 women sat around Judith's kitchen table like generals planning a campaign. Maps of the valley were spread before them, marked with defensive positions and escape routes. Each woman contributed her expertise to the growing plan. Cross will come from the east, Ruth said, tracing the main trail with her finger. It's the only approach that allows for mounted men in numbers. He'll send scouts first, Nancy added. Test our defenses, look for weaknesses. Jessica nodded. We need to make him think we're weaker than we are. Draw him into the valley where the terrain favors us. Judith studied the map, her mind working through possibilities and contingencies. The valley was a natural fortress if you knew how to use it. Steep walls on 3 sides, limited approaches, plenty of cover for defenders who knew the ground. What about ammunition? She asked. Ruth patted her saddlebags. Brought enough for a small war, plus some surprises from my Pinkerton days. She produced several sticks of dynamite, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth. Judith smiled grimly. Ruth had always been fond of explosives, a talent that had proven useful when dealing with entrenched criminals. The women spent 3 days preparing their defenses. They cached ammunition and supplies at strategic points throughout the valley. They prepared fallback positions and escape routes. Most importantly, they turned Judith's knowledge of the terrain into a tactical advantage that would multiply their effectiveness against superior numbers. On the 4th day, Jessica returned from a scouting mission with news that made everyone's blood run cold. Cross is moving, she reported. 30 men, not 25. He picked up some drifters along the way, plus a few professionals who heard about the bounty. 30-4. The odds were getting worse, but the women had faced impossible situations before and survived through skill, planning, and absolute trust in each other. When do they arrive? Judith asked. Tomorrow, maybe the day after. They're moving slow, probably planning to surround the valley before they attack. Judith nodded. It was what she would have done in Cross's position, cut off escape routes, then methodically destroyed any resistance. But Nathan Cross had made one crucial mistake. He was thinking like a man who fought other men, using conventional tactics against conventional opponents. What he faced was something entirely different. 4 women who had learned to fight like ghosts, striking from shadow and melting away before retaliation could find them. The Ghost Walker and her sisters were about to remind the territory why their names were spoken in whispers around campfires. Nathan Cross arrived at the mouth of Judith's Valley with 28 men at his back, confident that overwhelming force would settle the matter quickly. He was a big man with the soft look of someone who let others do his killing, but his eyes held the cold intelligence of a predator who had survived by being smarter than his prey. He called out across the distance separating him from Judith's cabin, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. Judith Foster, he shouted, you've caused me considerable trouble, woman. Cost me good men and money I can't afford to lose. Judith appeared on her porch, rifle in her hands but not quite aimed. From Cross's position, she looked small and alone, exactly as she intended. Nathan Cross, she called back. You sent men to steal my horse and threaten my home. What did you expect would happen? I expected a reasonable woman to accept a generous offer, Cross replied. Instead, I find myself dealing with a killer who murdered 6 men in cold blood. Self-defense, Judith said simply. They came armed and threatened violence. Cross laughed, the sound carrying no humor. Self-defense. That's rich, coming from the famous Sarah Gomez. Yes, I know who you are, know what you've done. The Ghost Walker, the Hawashwai. they called you. Well, your walking days are over." He gestured to his men, and they began spreading out in a wide semicircle designed to cut off any escape from the valley. It was a textbook maneuver, the kind taught in military academies and refined through years of Indian fighting. It was also exactly what Judith and her companions had expected. The first explosion came from the ridge above Cross's position, where Ruth had placed charges to trigger a rock slide. Boulders the size of houses thundered down the slope, crushing 3 men and scattering their horses in panic. Before Cross could react to this disaster, gunfire erupted from positions throughout the valley. Jessica had taken the high ground to the north, her rifle picking off targets with methodical precision. Nancy was concealed in the timber to the south, her shots coming fast and accurate. Ruth moved like smoke through the rocks, appearing long enough to fire before vanishing again. And Judith, the ghost walker herself, seemed to be everywhere at once. Her shots came from impossible angles, each one finding its mark with deadly precision. Cross's men, veterans of range wars and Indian fights, found themselves facing something they had never encountered. An enemy that struck without warning and melted away before they could respond. Every rock might hide a rifle. Every shadow might conceal death. The mathematics of the fight shifted with brutal efficiency. 30 men became 25, then 20, then 15. Those who survived began looking for escape routes rather than targets to shoot. Cross himself crouched behind a fallen log, his confidence shattered by the systematic destruction of his force. This was not how battles were supposed to go. Superior numbers should have guaranteed victory, but his men were being picked off like targets in a shooting gallery. "Sarah Gomez," he called out desperately, "let's talk about this. Work out some kind of arrangement." "The only arrangement I'm interested in," Judith replied from somewhere in the rocks above him, "is you and your men leaving my valley and never coming back." A bullet spanged off the log inches from Cross's head, emphasizing her point with lethal precision. "All right," he shouted. "Right, we're leaving." But as he said the words, Cross was already planning his revenge. He would return with more memapa, better guns. Maybe even call in favors from the territorial government. Sarah Gomez might have won this battle, but the war was far from over. Judith's next shot took him through the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him beside the log. When he looked up, she was standing 20 feet away with her rifle trained on his heart. "I know what you're thinking, Nathan," she said quietly. "You're thinking this isn't over, that you'll be back with more men and bigger guns." Cross said nothing, clutching his wounded shoulder and staring into eyes that held no mercy. "Let me save you the trouble," Judith continued. "I've sent word to every federal marshal from here to Denver. They know who you are, what you've done, and where to find you. Your days of buying judges and terrorizing honest folks are over." She gestured toward his surviving men, most of whom were already mounting their horses in preparation for a hasty retreat. "Take your boys and ride out," she said. "If I see you in my valley again, I won't be so generous with the warning shots." Cross struggled to his feet, supported by 2 of his remaining gunmen. Blood seeped between his fingers, but the wound was not fatal. Judith had placed it with surgical precision, intended to hurt, but not kill. "This isn't finished," he said through gritted teeth. "Yes," Judith replied calmly, "it is." The surviving members of Cross's gang rode away, leaving their dead scattered across the valley floor like broken dolls. Judith watched them disappear over the ridge before allowing herself to relax. Jessica, Ruth, and Nancy emerged from their positions, moving with the easy confidence of professionals who had just completed another successful mission. They gathered around Judith, checking for wounds and sharing the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. "Think that's the end of it?" Jessica asked. Judith looked toward the ridge where Cross and his men had vanished. "For now," she said. "But men like Nathan Cross don't give up easy. He'll be back, or someone like him will." Ruth grinned and patted her remaining dynamite. "Let them come. We know how to deal with their type." Nancy nodded agreement, her hand resting on her gun butt with unconscious readiness. Some things never changed, and the bond between these 4 women was one of them. They spent the next hour cleaning up the aftermath of the battle, dragging bodies away from the cabin and erasing the signs of violence as much as possible. By evening, the valley looked peaceful again, but all 4 women knew that peace was temporary. The ghost walker had returned to the territory, and word would spread like wildfire. Some would come seeking revenge. Others would arrive hoping to test themselves against a legend. The quiet life Judith had built as a widow was over, replaced by something harder but perhaps more honest. She stood on her porch as the sun set behind the western peaks, watching Black Tusk graze peacefully in the pasture. The stallion had been the catalyst for this violence, but he was also a symbol of everything worth fighting for. Home, freedom, the right to live without fear. Jessica joined her on the porch, following her gaze toward the horse. "Worth it?" she asked quietly. Judith considered the question while the last light faded from the sky. 5 years of peace had been shattered in a single morning, replaced by the familiar weight of violence and vigilance. But the alternative had been surrender, and that was not in her nature. "Yes," she said finally, "it was worth it." The four women sat together as darkness claimed the valley, old friends reunited by necessity and bound by shared purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to face and overcome. But tonight they were together again, and that was enough. The Ghost Walker had returned, and the territory would remember why that name had once struck fear into the hearts of evil men. Some legends never truly died, they just waited for the right moment to rise again. In the distance, a wolf howled its ancient song to the stars, and Judith Foster smiled. She was home.